So good afternoon, and usually I would say welcome to the desert, but with you I have to say welcome back since you were here a couple of years ago.
Yes, I was, and I want to come back all the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I always wondered on the TV show Dynasty, when Alexis Colby, the Joan Collins character, she'd go to La Mirage, and as a kid growing up in Maryland, even though the show took place in Denver, it was very deserty where she was going to get tennis players from the instructor she was sleeping with. And I wondered if that was supposed to be like Rancho Mirage. Yeah. Anyway, yes. Was it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that was sort of inefficient for her to take tennis lessons in a whole different time zone. Couldn't she find a place in Denver? Anyway.
So we're off to a good start. I love it like this.
Oh,
so
yeah.
CBS Sunday Morning.
Yeah.
Wait, don't tell me.
Yeah.
I love that show. It's got a cult following. I could talk to you just about that.
Can I just say about CBS Sunday Morning, and I don't know if we have viewers here. Well, great, yeah. And you have to get up early, so you're then very dedicated. That it's like going back to college and taking only electives, which I wish I could have done the first time. I mean, nowhere else would I be able to do, 1 week a story on the history of the pencil, the next week, President James Buchanan, then the next week a piece on Budge or something.
So while we're talking about CBS Sunday Morning, then what are the next things we can look forward to?
Well, I'm just coming from Canton, Ohio, yesterday where I'm shooting a story about President William McKinley, because he's been invoked a lot recently, and he's one of the obscure 19th century, early 20th century presidents that I hadn't done. The first clean-shaven president after a big long run of all those bearded guys from Ohio, and so I'm working on that, and I'm working on something about Saturday Night Live's 50th anniversary, and sort of the roots of that. Yeah.
So I asked you if you did the audio for your book. Right. That we're going to talk about today, and you said yes.
I did, for Roctogenarians.
And then I made this offhand comment that we were 40 hours into the 48 hours of Barbra Streisand, and you said you had a story you wanted to tell.
Well, I just wanted to point out that I'm a huge fan of hers, and I got to interview her. It was in a much smaller setting, not for CBS Sunday Morning, and her book, for anyone who read it or listened to it, it's got more food in there than a Cheesecake Factory menu. I mean, she just remembers everything she ate. It's kind of crazy. She'll say, oh, that was during the 6-Day War, and I'll never forget the cheesecake that, George Siegel's wife made for me at that moment. And so, and in the course of the interview, somehow we got onto the subject of poutine, which is Canadian, basically, disco fries, cheese curds with gravy and French fries. And she had never heard of poutine, and so I'll always feel proud that I introduced Barbra Streisand to poutine.
Okay, so Roctogenarians. The first question I have is, your first book was Mobituaries.
Mobituaries, right.
Roctogenarians,
yep.
And that's my question. Are you going to write a book that we can pronounce?
Well, that's a fair question, and I think you're doing well so far. The truth is I'm running out of names to turn into puns.
Well, so that's my next question. Your first name's Mo Obituaries, Roctogenarians, your last name. Do you have a middle name?
My middle name is Alberto, and that is not as conducive, I think, to a pun. If somebody can come up with something, I'll be happy to write it.
Okay.
But Mobituaries was about people who, when they died, I did not feel were commemorated in the way they deserved. Roctogenarians, I'm sort of moving backwards. Roctogenarians is about people who in the last third of their lives either broke through or peaked and did not accept the conventional wisdom that stage of life is a time to sort of clock out and, wind down.
And what made you consider that?
Well, I think it's fair to say that old people are my jam, as the kids say, and on CBS Sunday Morning, on my cooking show that I did for 4 seasons, where I went around the country learning to cook from grandmothers and grandfathers in their kitchens and hearing their stories, I've always gravitated towards older people. I think part of that may be having older parents growing up, which I always liked. I never was embarrassed by that. So perhaps I'm an old soul anyway. And I like any kind of piece where I can learn something. And I'm always going to learn something if I'm interviewing somebody who's older. Ageism is a real thing. It's stupid. It's not only wrong, it's just kind of dumb. We have all this great human capital. The population's aging whether or not we like that. And it seemed like a good moment to write about people now and in the past who did extraordinary things late in life.
So I love the cover of books. And, I would have asked you about where the title came from, but you've told us that. So what were you trying to tell us with the hourglass?
That was a design element that Simon & Schuster suggested. They gave us, my wonderful co-author, Jonathan Greenberg, and I, several different ideas. But I think that symbolizes well, with the sand being poured back in, that there's more if you let yourself imagine it. There's more to this stage of life, to this later stage of life, than we've been led to believe.
And what process did you use to go through and find out the people that you were going to use in here?
Great question. One of the interesting things is it was not actually hard to fill this book. And my co-author and I thought maybe the pickings would be slim. They were not. And it was surprising how many people in the past, soldiers in the Revolutionary War that fought in their 70s, right, that took up arms then, and in the Civil War as well. I at CBS Sunday Morning, my boss, I really revere, our executive producer is a master of what I call show mix and figuring out what pieces to combine and put next to each other. And so I'm a big believer that a book like this should have a lot of surprise, so that you should, and sometimes that's mixing high with low, people from different walks of life, so winemakers, athletes, civil rights leaders, so that, I almost look at it as protein and carbs. Some subjects will feel weightier, and so if you have Mary Church Terrell, who led sit-ins at the age of 86 in Washington, D.C., that's a very fortifying story and an important one. But then on the next page, you have, not literally in that case, but not far away from it, you have Mr. Pickles, the Houston Zoo tortoise, who became a father at 90.
We'll talk about him.
And I think it's important to sort of, to have a kind of a crackling mix like that. But it's about surprise, I think. That's important.
And that's what I loved about this. There are people that I know, from the work that they did, that you recognize their name, but there were surprises. And then it's really full of people and things and animals that you've never heard of. So I want to start with someone who I think you have a very fond relationship with, someone that you really love and like, and that's Rita Moreno.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I love Rita Moreno. And can I just tell you that I'm the father to a 6-month-old, and she is just everything. And Rita Moreno, I know this is really personal, but we've become friends, and she came over to our apartment, and she sang to our baby. Wow. It was kind of amazing. Yeah. I mean, she's an EGOT. And I was like, Josie, she's an EGOT. And Josie doesn't talk yet, so she doesn't know what an EGOT is. But I think she understood, sort of, you know what I mean? So Rita Moreno is somebody who obviously didn't break through late in life, but has continued going in chapter after chapter. And we paired her sort of with Morgan Freeman. They both were together on The Electric Company, a show that I loved growing up on PBS. And they had sort of very different trajectories. And so they were kind of good to pair together, and they're good friends. But Rita was somebody who had done all these extraordinary things early in life. Louis B. Mayer called her, I think, the Spanish Elizabeth Taylor, and signed her on the spot. She wins an Oscar for West Side Story. But she came to PBS because by then she was in her 40s, which for an actress at that point was old. And so she was doing this nice show that she knew her daughter would probably like. But then she kept going and had this whole career renaissance beginning in her 60s. And she's in her 90s now, and in her 80s was headlining a revival of One Day at a Time. And one thing I really liked about her in my conversations with her is that she didn't sugarcoat what it means to get to your 80s and 90s. And she told me this great story that I include in the book, where she said that when she left her home in Oakland, in Berkeley, and moved into not assisted living, but sort of a senior community, that she became very depressed. And then she realized one morning, oh, I don't know how to make friends anymore. And I thought that was really compelling. And that she sort of said, you know what? I have to learn, I have to rebuild that muscle. And at the grocery store, there was a woman she would see all the time that would smile at her, probably because she's Rita Moreno. But she decided to go up to the woman they'd never met and said, you have a lovely smile, would you have lunch with me? And the woman was startled, and they made a lunch date. And then 2 days later, they sat down, and the woman, the first thing she said is, can I ask you a question? Do you always go around the grocery store picking up random women? And she said, no, I don't, but I realize I need to do this. And it was a kind of, it's a kind of an ugly word, but a proactivity, I guess, that I thought was really important. And I found that in story after story. And people like Estelle Getty, who weren't just waiting around to be discovered. Estelle Getty was already in her 50s and had been trying all of her life to be a successful actress. And she went to see a play by a then unknown Harvey Fierstein, and she liked it, and she went backstage, introduced herself, and said, write me a part. And I found that so bracing, and he was so taken aback, and he did write her a part in what became Torch Song Trilogy. Cut to 62 years old, and she gets onto network television for the very first time. So I wanted stories like that in the book.
So I want to transition to someone that I don't think anyone here knows. I'd never heard of this woman. And I have to just call her by her first name because I can't pronounce her last name, but it's Ruth from Sacramento.
Yeah.
So tell us about Ruth.
So Ruth Slenczynska, it's a lot. Ruth Slenczynska is somebody that I met, that I profiled for CBS Sunday Morning when she was 97 years old. I was unfamiliar with her, and all I knew was there is this woman, a concert pianist, who has an album coming out, her first in 30 or 40 years. And so I said, sure, I'll do it. And she was wonderful. Ruth Slenczynska had been known as the Shirley Temple of classical music. As starting to play at 3 and 4 years old in Sacramento. When she was 9 years old, she subbed for Rachmaninoff. Like that Rachmaninoff, not like some other Rachmaninoff, okay? And she showed me the Fabergé egg pendant that he gave her. But her father was a frustrated Polish violinist who'd been injured in World War I and took out all of his frustration on her and pushed her so hard, stole her childhood from her. Literally on stage in Berlin, when she was 6 years old, at the curtain call, a little girl came up and handed her a doll, and out of a horror film, the father snatched it away because he didn't want any distractions from her, from pushing her to be the best she could be. And so she understandably quit piano when she was the ripe old age of 18 or 19. She had to come back to it later just to survive, to teach. But later in life, after having, thank goodness, of nurturing good marriage, she came back to the piano really on her own terms. And she said to me, you don't really learn to be a pianist until you're 60 anyway. The notes are the same, but the story you tell is different. And when I met her in her late 90s, she's now 100, she said she'd never had a better time playing the piano. So the piano had become this saga of a relationship, a very difficult, complicated one, but the longest lasting relationship of her life. And I thought it was the kind of story that a lot of people have. Oftentimes people, quit an instrument when they're young and regret it. But this was on a really grand scale. And so, yeah, so I love the story for all sorts of reasons. It also, to me, and I find a lot of the stories are this way, people returning to their childhood, revisiting it, but on their own terms, and And that's what happened with her.
So how did you find her?
Well, I had nothing to do with finding her. The producers of CBS Sunday Morning brought her to me. But after doing a TV piece on her, I thought we should include her in the book and dig a little deeper on her story.
So another one, it's an animation that we've all seen, that we in some ways all grew up with. Tell us about Tyrus, is that how you say it?
Tyrus Wong, yeah. So John and I wanted to include in the book a variety of people who broke through in different ways late in life. And we had a section of the book that's called It's About Time. Now, these are people that I consider sort of the anti-Van Gogh. Like Van Gogh, the whole thing is geniuses who die before they're really recognized. Well, what about people who accomplish a lot and are recognized only at the very end of their lives? They didn't. The bulk of the work may have been done earlier, and that included Tyrus Wong. Tyrus Wong was a Chinese-American artist who was really responsible for the look of Bambi, the feature film.
From Disney.
Disney's Bambi. He had, at the age of 8 years old, coming from an extremely poor family in China, so poor that the family would have to hang poultry on ropes so that the rats on the dirt floor couldn't get to them. He and his father left the mother and siblings, never saw them again, to come to America for the American dream. They were detained at Angel Island off the coast of California. At 8 years old, he was separated from his father for a month. I mean, that is a trauma right there. But eventually they were reunited, and the father saw artistic talent in his son and earned the money to put him through the Otis Art Institute in Pasadena, California. And Tyrus became steeped in the work of the Impressionists and the Song dynasty in China and developed this kind of abstract brushwork that, best put, kind of conveyed sort of moisture and mood. And it was less literal and hard-edged than the animation you'd see, say, in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was the first Disney blockbuster. And when Walt Disney himself saw this background work, he said, this is the work, this is the look that Bambi should have. So Tyrus Wong really created that look. He's in the credits, you can see in Bambi, but he never really got the credit he deserved. And very late in life, the Disney organization realized this and made him a Disney legend. And then a cascade of honors came after that. He was never, by the way, bitter about this. He lived until 106, but it was in his 90s when he began receiving all these accolades. And it's just such a great story of somebody who really deserved this. He's included along with Carmen Herrera, the abstract expressionist who had her first solo exhibition at a major art museum when she was 101. She was there for it at the Whitney. And John Goodenough, the 97-year-old Nobel laureate, who was the co-inventor of the lithium-ion battery. But these three people all had one thing in common. They all had marriages that lasted about 60 years and all credited their spouses with getting them through the periods when they were completely unrecognized.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about Mary Church Terrell, but it was such a fascinating story. So can you tell us a little bit more about her?
Sure. So we wanted to include a civil rights leader, and I can only speak for myself. When I think of the civil rights era and the heroes of that time, I think of young people, because John Lewis was 25 leading the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 34 when he delivered the I Have a Dream speech. But I wondered about older heroes, and our researcher, Zoe Marcus, found the story of Mary Church Terrell. Sometimes it's pronounced Mary Church Terrell. And Mary Church Terrell was born only a few months after the Emancipation Proclamation. As a young woman, she was an activist against the brutal practice of lynching. She even went to the White House with the much older Frederick Douglass to petition President Benjamin Harrison on this. As a middle-aged woman, she was a co-founder of the NAACP. And she had earned her rest, but when she was in her 80s, she was denied admission to the American Association of University Women, even though she was one of the first black women to have a higher degree, hers from Oberlin. And she was so angry that she rejoined the fight for civil rights, and she led sit-ins when she was 86, at a restaurant called Thompson's in Washington, D.C., where I'm originally from, because Washington, the citadel of democracy, still had segregated public accommodations in the 50s. And she led these sit-ins, and before she turned 90, the Supreme Court, it went all the way up the chain, ruled in favor of the integration of public accommodations, and she died shortly thereafter. But the reason I love this story is because I think that not enough can be said about the bravery of the younger people, but when you're that age, who are you doing this for? You are at best gonna live a short time in this better world that you hopefully create. I mean, this woman was really doing it for her literal and figurative children. And she indeed died very shortly after she won that battle. But I found that so powerful, older public servants.
So you referenced this of a soldier in his 70s, but there's just so much more about the story. So tell us about Samuel Whittemore.
Yeah, Samuel Whittemore, you know, we're about at the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, which begin the Revolutionary War. And on the very first day of battle, this old codger named Samuel Whittemore, he's 78 years old, he wants to go out and fight. And his wife is like, "Are you nuts? Stop it." And he goes out there, he picks off 3 redcoats before he has half of his face blown off, okay? Like a cheek, one of his cheeks is blown off, a redcoat stabs him in the head, and he survives and keeps fighting. And I just thought, this is the spirit we all need. And how has Clint Eastwood not played him in a movie? Like, it's the perfect movie. And
so we'll transition to Yoda. Why is Yoda in the book?
Well, that's more my co-author. I'm not a Star Wars person. I was about to say I'm not a Star Trek person, which tells you all you need to know. So, but Yoda is 900 years old and is full of a lot of wisdom. So he belonged in this section with fighters, with Samuel Whittemore and a Civil War fighter who was 70 years old.
So before I get to the animals that you have in the book, tell us, is there a theme to the book? Is there something you wanted us to get from the book and take away?
Well, I think that there are a few things. I have learned in my own work, especially with my cooking show, My Grandmother's Ravioli, it's a generality, but it seems to me that the older you get, the less you care about what other people think of you. And I think it frees you up to act and to do. And a lot of these people are unshackled and they're unfettered. And I think that's a lot of the qualities that we ascribe to younger people, not caring what the man thinks, going it alone, actually pertain more to older people. And so it's not surprising that we could easily fill this book. So I think that's one thing. And then I think there are other things that connect many of the people in the book. I think many of them look at endings as beginnings. So, you know, and I don't need to get into great detail here, but somebody like Matisse, already a hailed modernist, one of the greats by the time he's in his 70s, but he's also at that point robbed of the ability to paint by his stomach cancer, can no longer sit upright. But instead of just saying, well, let's do a greatest hits and let me sit here all day long and think about all this great stuff I've done, he instinctively trades his paintbrush for a giant pair of scissors and begins the era, the epoch in his career of paper cutouts, which itself would make for a monumental artistic career. And so he viewed an ending really as a beginning. The short story writer Borges, the Argentinian poet, wrote short stories before he went blind in his 50s and 60s, so he turns to verse poetry because he can compose it in his head. He doesn't, and so that's something he can do. Sam and Betsy Farber, who founded the OXO Good Grips empire, really.
Something I didn't know at all.
Yeah,
This is a great story.
They're living a good life. They're essentially retired in the south of France, where Betsy's trying to make an apple tart, and she can't because of her arthritis. And so the two of them enlist a designer and come up with the OXO Good Grip peeler, which spawns which is a breakthrough in universal design.
Something we probably all have in our house.
Oh,
one of
I
them.
love my OXO Good Grip. Yeah, healer, yeah. So I think, yeah, but there's a lot of connective tissue here. Yeah, oh, wow, that was unintentional, but I'll take the win.
So I hope you take this as a serious question, but do you aspire to be in this book someday? Is there something you want your legacy to be? Your 6-month-old daughter? What do you want your legacy to be?
I know what I want my first line of my obituary to be.
Okay, good.
It would be Mo Rocca, comma, who made people interested in things they didn't expect to be interested in, comma, died today, period. He was 128. It's always the first paragraph is 2 sentences, but it's that clause in the middle between those commas. That's everything right in there. So yeah, so that's I get no greater thrill than when people say to me, gee, that report you did, I didn't think that I would be interested in it, or that podcast or whatever, but that really got me. That makes me very happy.
And do you see doing that for a long time?
Yeah, because I think I can do it in different, whether it's a book, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a news piece, whether it's a series. That to me is yeah. But I'm also loving being a father. And Mr. Pickles, the 90-year-old tortoise who became a first-time father, was really my inspiration there. Yeah. I mean,
and again, how old was Mr. Pickles?
What's that?
How old was Mr. Pickles?
Mr. Pickles was 90 when he sired triplets with Mrs. I don't know if she's Mrs. Pickles. I don't know the status of the relationship. But he had 3 kids named Dill, Gherkin, and Jalapeno. It's really cute. Yeah, and he's expected to live until he's 150, so he could really end up becoming the Nick Cannon of tortoises. I mean, he could just keep having kids. And yeah. Yeah.
So I meant to ask you this in the beginning. Is your name really Mo? Did your parents name you Mo?
My father, when I was born in the late 1960s, was actually the American ambassador to Mozambique. And it's totally made up, but I just wanted to see how polite all of you were. That you kind of very sensitively went, you were thinking that's insane, but that's interesting. Then my mother was a hippie. She was hitchhiking across the Mojave Desert when I was born. My real name is Maurice.
We got to the truth.
Eventually.
Eventually. So tell us about Snowman the show jumper.
Yeah. So, look, we did not want to sugarcoat, as I said, what it means to get older. And physical limitations, of course, set in. Unless you're Diana Nyad, who at 64 actually completes the swim from Cuba to Key West. And she's in the book for a good reason. But there weren't a lot of great examples to draw on of people at that stage of life sort of defying the odds physically. I mean, there are obviously certainly all sorts of senior athletes. But we went the animal route on some. There are great horse stories. And Snowman was a great show jumper. Harry de Leyer was a Dutch horseman trainer who found Snowman at an auction and was late to the auction, and basically the horses that were left were all going to be slaughtered. And they looked at each other in the eyes and something happened. So he bought him for a mere pittance, brought him back home, and he had promised a neighbor that the next horse he got, the neighbor could have if the neighbor wanted. So Snowman went to the neighbor, but this is where the love story sort of intensifies. Snowman kept jumping outside the paddock and going back to Harry. They even attached a tire with a rope to Snowman, and Snowman was still able to jump over the fence with the tire to get back to Harry. At which point the neighbors said, "You two belong together, like, I'm out of here." And Snowman, by the time he was 11, became Horse of the Year for show jumping, which really at that point was really old. I mean, really old. He was already old at 8. And became part of the family. And Harry himself as a rider, defied the odds and was riding him very late. So it was just a wonderful story. There's a great documentary about Snowman also.
How about a local connection, Carol Channing?
Well, okay. So I love Carol Channing. I think she's great. And whenever when I ask Alexa, by the way, my daughter's going to think she has a sister like in the next room named Alexa, because I keep calling out Alexa. She's going to say like, I have a sister, but I've never met her. They keep her like inside this tube. And so anyway, so I'll always listen to Carol Channing's Hello Dolly. I like Carol Channing. But Carol Channing, I guess it was her third marriage, was not a happy one. And she went to the press and she said, look, I've had sexual relations with my husband twice in 40 years. And, let's just say that neither the matinee nor the evening performance received good reviews. So she wanted a divorce. And before the divorce went through, this man, who I have learned subsequently was a really beloved person, so I don't want to get in the middle of this, Anyway, so then but then she wrote a memoir, and in the memoir she wrote that she wishes she had married her junior high school sweetheart, Harry Colligian, when she was growing up in San Francisco. A mutual friend of Carol's and Harry's read Carol's memoir and went to Harry Colligian, who was still living, and said, oh, Carol wrote about you, and she still has a crush on you. And Harry's response was, Carol, I thought she was dead. Well, anyway, so they reconnected, and they married in their 80s, and I have met people that interviewed the two of them and said they could not have been happier, that they were like school kids. And so we wanted to include people coming out late in life, marrying late in life, having children late in life, and that just seemed like, personal milestones seemed like a wonderful story. Did you know Carol?
Yes.
Okay, and
Harry, they were lovely.
They were lovely, right?
Absolutely.
Of course, Jamie knows everyone.
That's right. I'm surprised he didn't introduce him, right? So are there some people that were on the list but didn't make the final cut? There wasn't enough room or whatever reason?
Wow, well, yes, and in fact, and I feel so conflicted about this, but the great club cabaret singer Marilyn May, who is a friend of mine and is absolutely fantastic, and I profiled her twice on CBS Sunday Morning. She's now 97. She sold out Carnegie Hall last year at 96, and she's so terrific. And I was sitting down to write about her. We were under a pretty tight deadline with this book. And then my mother, who lives in the same building with me, who is the most private person I know, came to me and said, are you going to write about me? And at first I thought she was kidding, and then she asked again. I went, oh my God, she's serious. So I had to choose my mother, because I quite literally had time left for one person in space. So if there's a sequel, Marilyn, who has an extraordinary life. She made more appearances on Johnny Carson than anyone else, as a singer at least. And she really had a comeback at 77. I mean, her life is, she's just a force of nature. But my mother's pretty great too. So.
And we'll get to your mother.
Yeah,
I want to end with your mother. And Marilyn May's another local connection.
Yeah, you're right. I know she's from Kansas City, but she spends a lot of time out here, right?
So why did you include Laura Ingalls and Frank McCourt?
Well, the writers, I included them for a few reasons. First of all, writing is something I think that a lot of people aspire to do and should do, whether or not they're published. And it's something you can do later in life. And both those stories, I think, are really compelling. Frank McCourt, all of his life, struggled with the idea that he felt that his story was not worth telling. He was ashamed of the poverty he had grown up with in Limerick, Ireland. He was friends with other writers in New York City, big writers. He taught English at Stuyvesant High, and he would use stories of his youth to kind of keep the kids in the tent, right? And the kids would say, you got to write about your life. Everyone was telling him he had to write about his life, but he couldn't come to terms with it for the longest time. When his mother died, he felt like he was a little freer to write, which I think a lot of people can relate to. And he ultimately decided that if he didn't get his story out, he would die howling, his words. He finally wrote his story, and at 66, Angela's Ashes, his debut, was released. It sold 4 million copies, a global sensation. And he later said, it took two years and all of my life to write my story. Mm-hmm. And I not only loved the book, I never got to meet him, but I'm sure I would have loved him. Any tape on him you see, he seemed just like a wonderful person. But that idea of somebody really struggling, wondering if their story is worth telling, I find so poignant and a little bit heartbreaking, because when you think what would have been lost had he not told his story. Yeah.
And what about Laura Ingalls?
Well, I grew up loving the Little House books and the series, loved them. And I did not know that Laura Ingalls Wilder's life after those prairie years was so difficult. She and Al Manso, her husband, Dean Butler played him in the series, they moved from state to state, sometimes chased by creditors. They ended up in the Ozarks of Missouri. They had one daughter, who herself became a sort of controversial figure, Rose Wilder. But Rose Wilder they were too poor, she couldn't even wear shoes to school. She was mocked by classmates. Laura did want to write, and she ended up writing a domestic life column for an agricultural journal called the Missouri Ruralist. But her daughter told her, no, Mom, you lived this epic life. You were there for the transition from frontiersmen to pioneers to farms to small towns. You were there for the closing of the frontier in 1890. You need to write your story down. And she said, well, who wants to hear my story, and how will I even write it? And her daughter gave her such an amazing piece of advice. She said, Mom, write as if you're writing in your diary only for yourself. And that's what Laura Ingalls Wilder did. And at first, a more adult version of her story came out, and it was an editor at Knopf who looked at it and said, no, no, write this for children. And franchised children's series were not a thing then. And this was during the Depression, at a time when this editor felt that the audience would want to hear stories about hard-scrabble frontier life. And she did that, and she was 65 when the first of those 8 books were published, and they, of course, were a sensation. And I love those books anyway, and they're globally really popular because the stories are so foundational. But it's a great American story.
So after I read the very first story in the book, I went back to the index because I figured that you would write about these 3 people: Norman Mailer, Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner.
Norman Lear, right? Yeah.
Norman Lear,
Yeah.
yes. So tell us about them, and tell us about laughter.
Well, you know, I think we debated whether or not to include those 3 because they were so successful all of their lives. And I think people, understandably, are more riveted to stories of breakthroughs late in life. But these 3 men, Norman Lear, Mel Brooks, and Carl Reiner, it's hard to get your arms around it, but collectively, they are responsible for so much of what we've laughed at in the last 75 years. I mean, these 3 men who share a lot in common, all of them were Jewish. Mel Brooks is still with us. All served during World War II bravely, and contributed to comedy in such fundamental ways. I mean, Carl Reiner basically created the narrative sitcom with the Dick Van Dyke Show. Norman Lear took the sitcom and made it say something, right, with All in the Family and Maude and shows like that. Mel Brooks is a little different. It was admittedly driven more by anger, fascism, and Hitler, and the power of comedy to knock somebody like that off his pedestal. But, you know, when people say laughter keeps you young, it seems like an empty cliche. But when those 3 say it, they have real authority, and they really believed it. And I think it's not so much the laughter, but the engagement with the world. They remained engaged until the very, very end. Also had this great friendship. But we thought it was important to pay tribute to them.
So I want to end with your mother, but we have enough time, I think, because we've all grown up eating Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Yeah.
And I think that's the first story in the book, if I remember correctly. But I didn't, kind of like Paul Harvey said, I didn't know the rest of the story. I mean, I just figured it'd always been there. So tell us about his late in life adventure.
Well, you know, Harlan Sanders' story has been out there a lot, but it's a great story. And we tried to dig a little deeper here. So Harlan Sanders had a pretty tough upbringing, lost both parents early, helped support his siblings, worked all sorts of jobs, including midwife. But by the time he was in this middle age, he was living his life. He was doing fine. He had a Shell gas station / chicken and biscuits joint in Corbin, Kentucky. He was doing fine. And then a highway cut through Kentucky, an interstate, and it bypassed Corbin. The bottom fell out of his business. He had to sell it at loss at an auction. You know, I referenced the movie Psycho because the same thing happened to Norman Bates, remember, a highway. But Harlan Sanders responded much more constructively. Okay. So anyway, but he was 66. He was living on Social Security, $105 a month at this point. And he could have subsisted. But instead what he did is he got in his car with 2 pressure cookers and a big bucket of his secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices, and he drove town to town to town, cooking for people on spec. If they didn't like the food, they didn't have to pay for it. And within 8 years, he was the face of a global empire with 800 stores. And that act of getting in that car and just driving just says so much. You know, this is a person not looking back. This is a person who's doing what he feels he needs to do, and he's acting. He's unshackled, he's unfettered, and I find that story always inspiring.
And is that why it's the first story?
Yeah, and also because most of us love KFC. I don't know that I love the fried chicken sandwich. I think the Popeyes one might be better, and I do think a lot of people have complained about the quality of KFC, including Harlan Sanders himself, who, by the way, towards the end of his life was not eating it at all. He ate sardines every morning. I love sardines, and I love anchovies. I know, don't get too close.
So I want to end with your mom. Tell us about your mom.
Well, my mother is an immigrant from Colombia, and again, as I said, she asked to be written about, which surprised me, and I think the reason she wanted to be written about is I think she wants to leave something to be remembered by, which I think is an impulse we all have. But I also think she wanted to know that her own story is worth telling. And so I did that thing that we often drag our feet doing, which is I sat down with her and I interviewed her. And the story that she told, and I think she surprised herself, these are all the facts, is as a very young person, 3 months old, her father, hoping for the American dream, packed up the family, at that point 3 children, and brought them all from Bogota to New York City. And his timing couldn't have been worse. It was the fall of 1928. And the next year, everything fell apart, and the family, by then 5 kids, 2 more were born, a few years later, had to make what I imagine is the most humiliating reverse commute, leaving the United States to go back to the country you came from, where you hope, you know. And her father remained a dour and gloomy person for the rest of his life. And then cut to the late 1950s when my mother was a young woman in her 20s. And she came to the United States, not speaking a lick of English, stayed with some friends, was terribly homesick. Her mother said, come home, but something made her stay. She learned English, she met my father, they built a small business together. And in telling her story, my mother really had not considered that she was able to do what her father, unfortunately, was unable to do. And I hope that that is a gift to her, because I said, and I meant it, I said, Ma, you did this great thing. It's amazing what you did. And I think that's why she wanted to tell. I think she wanted to find the value in her own story.
So we have enough time. I want you to read the last paragraph of the book, which is about your mom, the last 2 paragraphs.
Oh, okay.
Right there.
Time with my mother is a gift, even without daily disclosures. I have great access to her since she lives just upstairs in the same building. I like doing laundry with her. She insists on line drying about half of her clothes, like if we're living like in a tree grows in Brooklyn or something. And it's fun introducing her to people in the neighborhood. Isaac Mizrahi complimented her eyewear. She's got impossibly chic tortoise-shell glasses from the 1950s. They're not a fashion statement. She just didn't want to throw away perfectly good frames. I took her to see the late, great Cheetah Rivera's nightclub act and afterwards introduced them. That was special. She had seen Cheetah in the original production of West Side Story. Another gift, that my mother allowed me to write about her at all. You can damn well bet she had approval over this. Until recently, she seemed to dismiss her own story. Too long and complicated, she would say. She may still be very private, but she's come to recognize that her story is worth telling. It's amazing, no? She mused during one of our chats. I'd say so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you. Always great talking to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.